Hello and welcome to another episode of the Omnibus Podcast, Minnesota's best weekly breakdown of political news inside and outside the Capitol. I'm your host, Jeremy Munson, former state representative from southern Minnesota. We have a special episode for you today. We're joined by hot air columnist David Strom and State Representative Walter Hudson. Today we're going to discuss legislation both banning and promoting sex change operations for minors, which have passed in several U.S. states. Conservative states, including Iowa and South Dakota and Tennessee, have passed legislation protecting children, whereas Minnesota passed just the opposite, promoting sex change operations and creating a transgender sanctuary state. We saw our lieutenant governor just recently wear a T-shirt promoting violence to protect trans youth, and the press secretary for the governor of Arizona put out a tweet yesterday after the shooting in Tennessee with an angry woman holding two guns saying, "Us when we see transphobes." So this rhetoric has really come right on the House floor of the Minnesota legislature. Walter, you had a very powerful speech this week addressing Lee Finke as his bill to create a sanctuary state came to the floor. It's been clipped and shared by Democrats and Republicans in this fight. And you used a term that was very powerful. It was called what? It was trans jihadi or trans jihad.
Yeah, so that wasn't in my House floor remarks. That's something that has kind of coalesced over the last 24, 48 hours as there's been this thread that has been needled through both the trans refugee bill here in the state of Minnesota and the horrific incident which occurred on Monday in Nashville, Tennessee, with the killing of 6 people, 3 of whom were 9-year-old children. I have a 9-year-old of my own. It's unthinkable that could happen. And while the details are still being sorted out, the pieces are falling into place, and a pattern is emerging that indicates that we're dealing with a gender jihad. And that's not just a turn of phrase that I've come up with for rhetorical purposes. That is an accurate depiction of what I think we are witnessing, which is an illiberal movement to opt out of the social contract that underlies and undergirds Western civilization, and to tell a group of people the rules don't apply to you. And what are the rules? The rules are we all have irreconcilable, fundamental, sacred beliefs about everything, about existence, about God, about nature in the universe, spirituality. You've got, even within the Christian domain, you have a gazillion different denominations, right? And there was a time in history where denominational differences between Christians were the cause of wars, all right? We got past that by developing this classically liberal social contract. And the terms of the deal are, look, I get to believe the thing that I believe. You get to believe the thing that you believe. And that's it. We don't touch each other. We don't slit each other's throats over it. We don't get to steal each other's stuff. We don't get to exclude one another from institutions and from access to public accommodation on the basis of having differences of belief. That's the deal. Well, the trans community clearly has not gotten that memo because they're going around insisting, and it's particularly there's a word that's not quite coming to the tip of my tongue, but it's prolific in terms of the way it creates conflict because of the nature of what transgenderism is. Transgenderism, a Christian and a Jew could be sitting side by side or engaging in conversation, and their fundamental differences in belief may never come up, right? Like, you just might not be something that you have to contend with ever in the course of a social interaction. But when you're dealing with somebody who's transgendered, they expect you to use their pronouns. They're sitting right in front of you. In the back of your mind, you are perceiving the reality that you perceive, and it's in discordance with the way that they're presenting themselves. And so it creates this persistent, chronic, continual tension. And what we're dealing with right now is, how do we deal with that? How do we integrate that tension into the classically liberal social contract, which says you can believe your thing about yourself, and I can believe my thing about my perception of reality. And that has to be fine. In order for us to have a civilization, that tension has to be okay. And we both have to be able to get past it and move on. This is how we dealt with racism. It's how we got from 1964 to 2023. This is how we've dealt with Islamic terrorism. When's the last time you heard about an Islamic terror attack? It's been a while, right? Because this is how we've been dealing with it. We've been engaging with the communities and saying, look, how's this working out for you? Because it's not working out very great for us. You think you might be able to get a better deal if you come with us, if you want to live and sign on to this social contract we've been using, where we got all kinds of differences amongst the things that we believe, and we're not killing each other. Sound good? And apparently it does, because we've been able to integrate um, more Muslims into that social contract over the course of the last 2 decades than we had previously, and that's a good thing. And that's what we need to do with the trans community as well.
Yeah, and David, welcome to the podcast. You wrote a really interesting article yesterday about the shooting in Tennessee, and it was really talking about victimhood and how the media has really changed throughout the first day or 2 days of reporting on this. You you actually used a graphic on the beginning of your article that talks about how many times the shooter was misgendered. And that it's really immediately stepping forward and making the victim, making the shooter into the victim, and tying that. You want to explain?
Well, first of all, I feel really at a disadvantage because I'm following Walter. And Walter just proved that he's one of the smartest men out there. He gave this wonderful discourse about liberalism and how we can all get along in, 2 minutes or something like that. I'm not going to be as good as he on this. I'm more articulate when I write than when I speak. But let me make a few points here. Yes, the mainstream media, which I think is actually doing more to promote what we're seeing today, the sense of fear, the desire for violence in the trans community, than any other group of people. I think Biden and a lot of politicians are pushing this, and they have convinced the many people in the trans community. Although I'm going to make an argument, there are two different trans communities here. One driven by transgender ideology and one driven by gender dysphoria, which I think is a mental illness. But we've had transgender people in society, certainly as long as I've been alive. And they have been, few in number, a very tiny percentage of the population. They have a genuine mental illness called gender dysphoria. And dysphoria is, by definition, a mental illness. And I suspect that for most of them, they just wanted to be left alone to live their lives. Really, we were aware they existed. We all had a sense that there was something deeply wrong with them, but we didn't feel threatened by them. But now there's this gender ideology out there that promotes the idea that there is a trans genocide going on. And that's what has been underlying. In fact, it's very similar to the jihadist ideology that promoted the idea that, well, we can't get along. Our irreconcilable differences are such that one side or the other is going to kill the other off. And so let's do it first. That is what is being promoted by the transgender activists and by the mainstream media, who I think are very clearly part of the problem here. And you see that in the coverage. They're already rewriting the story here, where this had to be done. It was striking back against the trans genocide. And to put that in context, if you look at the most radical groups out there who talk about any kind of crime, violent crime against transgender people, not hate crimes, of which over the past 8, 10 years, the FBI has maybe 20 or 30 in the entire country out of 330 million people. But if you look at any kind of crime, violent crime against trans people, it happens at 1/2 the rate of the general population, and about 7% of the rate of what happens to male Black teens. They are among the least violently offended against people in the entire United States, but they have been convinced that there's a genocide going on. And that's why you see the Trans Day of Vengeance. I mean, vengeance against what? And I think that is what we're really facing here. It's a fairly new phenomenon, really, over the past 2, 3 years. And it's part of a culture war that the left is pushing against society. And then they project that those of us saying that, well, wait a sec, you're trying to eradicate Western civilization, as Walter put it. And we start defending ourselves verbally and through laws. That's what's at stake. And I can go deeper into that because part of the trans genocide that they see is actually just the rest of society saying, stay away from our kids. And that is based upon the notion or the fact that trans people do not reproduce biologically. And so their only means of reproducing is to recruit children into the cult. And so many of them actually believe that the laws preventing the medicalization of any kind of mental illness is a direct attack on the community. And so they see this as irreconcilable differences. They see the attempt to protect children as an attack on them as a group. So that's sort of in a nutshell how I see this.
Yeah, and I appreciate you tying it in with legislation at the end. And from the timeline of people speaking out against trans people, it really wasn't. I mean, I don't know where you guys are on trans in general, but I we can talk about classical liberalism and what it means and how it plays into this. But if live your life and be your own person and coexist is kind of the philosophy under which I live. But when it crossed over into children, that's what engaged so many people on the conservative side to say, wait, it started with the drag show, drag queen story hour, right? And this weird trend or phenomenon of even school districts participating in bringing in transgender people to strip in front of their little the students. But then with these new laws that are passed, like in Minnesota, creating a trans sanctuary for children to get sexual reassignment or sex change operations or being chemically castrated. And then states like Iowa, I think South Dakota also passed it, Tennessee now banning those procedures just for children. And if you want to be an adult and have a sex change, go for it. But this is protecting children. And that's where this fight has really escalated. Walter, what do you see? I mean, do you see this legislation that we passed in Minnesota as being something that's going to engage more people on the conservative side, or do you think that the Minnesota GOP is going to be messaging to back down and not engage in this culture war?
Well, I mean, I'll just pull back the curtain and tell you explicitly that I've received nothing but support from everybody that I've spoken to on our side. I mean, I haven't had, well, with the very public exception of Michael Broadcorp, whose podcast I'm going to be going on. And so that's going to be interesting. I'm actually really looking forward to engaging with his arguments and his ideas. But I think the biggest mistake we could make as Republicans and as conservatives is to look at this as a moment of partisan opportunity. because I think the partisan opportunity will emerge organically by going after the actual problem and addressing the actual problem, because the actual problem here is so much deeper than federalism or parental rights or custodial battles or any of that stuff. This issue and the way things have played out in the past few days, where you have these high profile legislative battles in several states, and then the inflection point of the Nashville shooting, people dying, blood on the streets, and it's all tied together conceptually. What this has presented us with is an inflection point. And it's a similar inflection point collectively as a society that an addict gets to when they decide whether or not they're going to make their life better. We have hit philosophical rock bottom. And what I mean by that is, as Representative Finke presented the bill, it was described as providing people, including children with no age limits, access to what they call gender affirming care, which was described as being two things: one, medically necessary, and two, life saving. Now, that concept of gender affirming care, which includes, I'll be kind and say, the dispensing of hormone treatments in order to block puberty, in order to intervene in the natural developmental process of a child, and also to surgically alter people, including children, in order to approximate them appearing to be the other sex. That's what it includes. So you look at those acts, you look at intervening in a kid's puberty and cutting them up to try to make them look like the opposite sex. And I ask myself, and I think a lot of people ask themselves, how could that ever be medically necessary or life-saving? Well, peel back the onion. Underneath that premise is the premise that the reason why it's life-saving, and the reason why they talk about genocide, and they sincerely believe that there's an effort ongoing to commit a genocide against trans people, is because their fundamental concept is that a man actually can be or become, it's not quite clear whether he is or he becomes, but a man actually can be a woman and vice versa. That's their belief. And because that belief, obviously, through their own admission, through the implications of what they're prescribing, surgery, chemicals, hormones, that belief is not affirmed in physical reality. And so in order for that belief to be affirmed, and they use that word, gender affirming, in order for that belief to be affirmed, it has to be confessed with the mouth, right? It has to be assented to intellectually. That transgenderism only exists as a concept. And because it only exists as a concept, to the extent you undermine the concept by pointing to reality and saying the emperor has no clothes, you are committing genocide, quote unquote, on transgenderism, because that's all it is. All it is an idea. And so if you reject the idea, you're rejecting the identity. That's how they view it. Those are the stakes in their view. Now, that isn't even the bottom. We got to peel back the onion one more time. And then we get to the real existential premise upon which all of this is based. And that is something that was emailed to me by a resident of this state on this topic. And her underlying premise was, reality is not fixed.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Then I guess we're done here. Right? Like, but, and by we, I mean civilization, humanity, existence. I guess we're done here because there's nowhere to go from there. And if that's your underlying premise, that reality is not fixed, that there is no objective standard, that we don't have any means of determining what's true, what's false, what's right, what's wrong, then classical liberalism doesn't work. Because,
Well,
yeah.
Uh, that actually is the point. I mean, the transgender ideology is a subset of critical theory, really. And critical theory exists. And what it is critical of is liberalism. It is a subset of Marxism. And the reason why they are pushing this particular idea, there are actually several. If you go back, I have the misfortune of having studied political philosophy. I was briefly a college instructor in political philosophy. And so I read Marx and then the post Marxists. And one of the things that the post Marxists had to contend with is that Marx viewed himself as a scientist. And what he was doing was predicting what was going to happen. Communism was not just an ideology, it was a historical prediction that there are stages to history, and the next stage was communism. Communism never came about organically. And so what they decided was, well, we have to hasten that process. And the only way to hasten that process is undermine every institution that undergirds our society, liberal society, capitalist society. And that's the origin of critical theory is, wait a sec, our predictions didn't work. We actually have to make this happen. And so Engels, ironically enough, more than Marx, is the intellectual father of modern day Marxism, because he understood that it's the social institutions, particularly the family and the church, more than the economy, that undergird our society. And there is no more powerful way to undermine the family and the church than to go straight for the kids. And so you see again and again and again. I live on Twitter now because I write. I write 6 articles a day, so I'm desperately looking for content. And you will see teacher after teacher after teacher deriding parents as moral teachers and elevating themselves as the experts, and up to the point where they actually will admit that they're conspiring to separate children from their parents. They'll say it, that the parents are the enemy. And the reason why that's the case is they really want to undermine the sense of groundedness of reality that family and church provide, a context. I mean, really, kids are born with very few concepts in their head, although ironically enough, male and female comes very quickly because they are embodied. It's like, dude, I have a penis, or she doesn't. Uh, but once you can separate out kids' minds from a sense of reality and the reference for how reality works, which is the parent, then you can mold them into anything, including the terrorists that we're starting to see develop. And so the origin really goes back to the failure of Marx to have predicted things. Out of that, you get the development of critical theory. Out of that, you get what was called the march through the institutions. We're going to take over institutions one at a time. And you can see that many churches have become left wing ideology institutions. Higher ed clearly has gone that way. Now you've got K through 12 that has moved that way. And they have the greatest advocate. He's not good, but he's a powerful advocate in the President of the United States, who sits down and celebrates with people who, literally a person who pretends to be a girl, not even having gotten real gender affirming care. 1 year ago, he decided, I'm going to be a girl. And now he's meeting with the President of the United States. That's what the march through the institutions is about. And the goal is the destruction of liberal society. They realized that they weren't going to get there through the natural process. They realized once the labor movement came about that the proletariat was not going to rise up. The proletariat was actually going to, quote, collude with the capitalists to get a bigger share of the pie. And so they needed another way. And so ultimately, it's about destroying capitalism and destroying liberal society. That's also what climate change is all about. It's the same thing,
Yep.
same ideology.
David, two of the institutions that you forgot to mention were the media and entertainment, right? I mean, Hollywood in general has bought into this hook, line, and sinker. Walter, how has the media responded to your opposition on the floor and your communication on Twitter? Because it seems like, much in the same respect when conservatives talk about our opposition to illegal immigration, but I think most conservatives would say we want legal immigration. It gets spun in the media as some just general hatred towards immigration, which is wrong. Here, the opposition is really to, we don't want the transgender to being promoted in our youth and our kids, right? But it's being spun just as just general hatred from Republicans.
Yeah, I mean, so the reaction that I've had, or at least that I'm aware of from the media, seems to have been a lot of silence. Like, I haven't seen a lot of mention, like even in the reports, and there's some of that had to do with the timing of, we went until 5 a.m. before the bill was passed, and so I'm sure a lot of people gave up and went to bed, and it was going into a Friday, so it's the Friday news dump, so a lot of people probably didn't even start hearing about this until Monday, and there was a bigger story by then, the Nashville thing, right? And so timing may have played a role in it, but I theorize that the real reason why the only media requests I've gotten are from a podcast I had never heard from before, and a couple of student journalists, is because they can't contend with my narrative.
You're
The
too
only thing that
smart.
happens, the only thing you can only handle me in one of two ways, and I suspect that Broadcorp is going to try this first one. Okay, you can try to talk over me and obfuscate and present a bunch of red herrings and ask irrelevant questions and misconstrue what it is that I'm saying and make me argue against your straw man. You can do that, or you can let me say what I actually mean, and I'm going to do so in a concise and clarifying way that gets my point across. And that's what they're most afraid of, right? They don't want to give me a platform for that.
I think we have to clarify something about this bill, because I actually think that most people don't understand what is meant by sanctuary. What is meant by sanctuary is a parent can kidnap a child. There can be a court order saying that it's shared custody or they don't even have custody. The parent can kidnap the child, escape to Minnesota. And most Amber Alerts, by the way, are parents kidnapping children. Come here and be protected by the state if they want to sterilize and mutilate their children. So we've carved out this exception to custody rules based upon the idea that preventing, saying to an 11-year-old girl who, by the way, in many states can't get earrings without parental permission, right? Certainly won't be able to get a tattoo without parental permission, can get her breasts chopped off without parental permission. And Minnesota passed a law that says, yes, you may kidnap a child and bring them to this state, and we will defend you against lawful orders. That's remarkable. I mean, it really is shocking. And it's based upon a very false notion, which is without gender affirming care, you will have a dead child. Do you want a transgender child or a dead child? Now, there weren't a lot of dead bodies. I mean, this did not exist a decade ago, and there was no epidemic. Uh, you know, these children are by definition mentally ill. They have much higher levels of depression, but it's still a tiny number. And I mean, if you look at Sweden, Great Britain, Norway, where they've decided, well, wait a second, we made a big mistake going down this path because, in fact, the number of suicides actually hits its highest level among transgender people at 7 years after transitioning, not before, after. So, and you can see this actually. There has been a show on for a decade or so. I Am Jazz. And if, first of all, it is proof positive that everything they say about what happens at what stage, what they're doing to children is just a lie because they put this little boy on puberty blockers at 8 years old and have been performing surgeries as a minor to this child. The surgeries have all gone very badly. And they're still filming this show. And this now transition girl spends all her time crying. She has been mutilated. When they talk about perfectly reversible and we're going to transition you, this person will never have an orgasm, can never have a sex life at all, because they started at 8 years old. And well, in order to create this quote fake clitoris, we needed to have a developed penis, and it never happened. And the doctor's excuse is, well, this is the first time we've ever done this. We didn't know. And I mean, you can go on YouTube and watch the head of WPATH, the person who advocates for this in the world, who sets the standard, who performed this surgery, say, well, this is the first time. It didn't go that well, Jazz. She's had, I think, now 2 or 3 bottom surgeries that have been botched and is profoundly unhappy. And you can watch that on TV. Everything that they say is a lie. And this is, by the way, the kid who they've been promoting as the poster child. The poster child. And she's horribly depressed. Her mother is hideous to her. Keeps on pushing her to do things or him to do things that he doesn't want to do. And that's transgenderism right there. It's being imposed from above, from without, on children who, I mean, even the left says they're not capable of making all sorts of other decisions. They will not actually prosecute a 25-year-old for murder because their brain wasn't formed, but they'll chop off body parts because, as Peggy Flanagan says, when a child tells you who they are, it's your job to listen.
I want to hit back on that point you made about how suicide actually peaks after transition and tie it back to what I was saying earlier about how it is that they're able to come to this premise of genocide against transgenders. And the point that was made was transgenderism only exists as an idea. And so if you deny the idea, you are destroying transgenderism.
Yep.
And that's the genocide as they see it. The reason why suicide increases 7 years or peaks 7 years after transition is because once you've transitioned, there's no other physical conformity you can achieve with the idea in your head. And then you're confronted every day with the reality that no matter how much you explicitly deny it, no matter how much you present as being something that you're not, you are in your body, and your body is what it is, and it functions how it functions, and you know what you are.
Yeah, well, I think about the idea I was born in the wrong body.
Yeah.
I mean, by definition, that's wrong. I mean, it makes no sense. You
Right.
may have been born into a body that you don't like. I can understand that. I mean, I'm 5'5". I wish I were 6'5". Uh, uh, I my life would have been totally different if I were 6'5". It would have been totally different if I were 7'2". Uh, eh, but I am who I am. When you say I was born into the wrong body, that is a logically incoherent thing. You were born. You were embodied. That's what it means to have been conceived and born and to live. And at some point, you're going to die in that body. I mean, it's not your mind alone that lives, your mind and your body are together. And again, it goes to the sense, and Walter's absolutely right, that there is no reality. Reality is what we think, which is why you have, Harvard graduate students saying, well, 2 + 2 could equal 5. I mean, literally, I mean, go look it up. He's like the statistics geek on Twitter. And, he's been interviewed, there have been profiles, and, he starts going into all this sort of jazz about 2 + 2 = 5. It all depends upon how you look at it, and we can define this way. And it's like, no, 2 + 2 = 4. I mean, there was a whole Star Trek: The Next Generation episode about this, and now I'm sure Captain Picard would say, "Well, it all depends on how you look at it."
Well,
But it was
let's tie this back into legislation, because I think, not even legislation, but elections in general. Because I think that when you go on the podcast with Broadcorp, Walter, one of the things that he's been talking about is how Republicans are going to win in 2024. He just had Karen Housley on his podcast, who was talking about how Republicans need to message to the center more. And then she said, but we don't need, we can still vote conservatively, but we should be messaging to the center, which I think is a disingenuous position, because then basically you're saying we should be lying in order to win votes, which Republicans will argue that's what Democrats did in the last election, promising things that they went against once they were elected. But how do Republicans message on these positions? I mean, the Democrats have dragged us into this culture war. How do we actually win on this in 2024 without pivoting?
Well, and this is a continual frustration of mine, because I don't think and I haven't listened to that interview. It's on my to-do list now, because I want to hear what she said, and I don't want to assume anything about where Karen Housley's coming from. But I think that far too often when we use words like the center and moderates and independents, that we're actually, ironically, imagining something that doesn't exist. We're imagining that there's this person out there who is just indecisive, has no convictions, has no principles, doesn't really care about morality or culture or social cohesion. And really, their biggest priority is just that we're nice to each other, and that we say pretty things, and that we present well. If that's true, if our politics depends upon being that and presenting to that, and being nice, delicate little facsimiles of something that we're not, in hopes that we'll be able to trick them into voting for us so that we can then have a chance to do some of the things we want to do. If that's truly the situation that we find ourselves in, then I don't want to be good at this. Okay. Like, I'm not interested in it. I don't want to participate in that type of politics. And if it means that I and my party don't get elected, then that's what it means, because we were never going to be able to do anything worthwhile anyway. If that's the culture we live in, we're never going to be able to do anything worthwhile anyway, and it's all over. Fortunately, I don't think that's true at all. I think that the people who are at the center, the people who are at the middle, the people who are independent, the people who can vote this way and then turn around and vote the other way, they are best. And I've used this analogy before. They're best exemplified by my in-laws, because my in-laws are not, some of them are hardcore Republicans, some of them are hardcore Democrat, but most of them are just kind of living their lives, and they catch the news and they react and they kind of go with the same trends and cycles and currents that have defined every election cycle, going back historically. Um, and when you talk about, and yeah, of course we've got a message to them. Of course we do. But what does that mean? Does that mean that we don't talk about the fact that we're going to secede from the union, in effect, and nullify the parental custody of other citizens of the United States so that we can poison and mutilate children in the name of a lie? We're not going to talk about that because it doesn't play well to the center. No, we are going to talk about that. And we're going to talk about it by appealing to the values that those people in the center hold. And look, the center, not even just the center. All right. David very academically and astutely went through the history of Marxism and taught me something. I guess I owe you tuition now about the history of Marxism and how it unfurled throughout history. Most people, even those who vote Democrat every time, aren't on board with those fundamental philosophical ideas. They are not trying to deconstruct the universe. That's not their goal. They just want to live in it peacefully and with prosperity. And that's the problem with transgenderism as a concept. You had said earlier, David, that you talked about people feeling that like they're born in the wrong body. Okay, well, if you're born in the wrong body, if that's something that can happen, you can also be born into the wrong reality. And when you get to that point, when you get to the point where it's not just you that's wrong, it's the world that you live in and the people in it that are also wrong, that's how you can justify in your own head picking up 2 guns, going to a Christian private school, and shooting 6 people, including 3 9-year-old children. That's how that happens. And so I think the way to message to the middle is to message the same way I message to everybody. I don't change how I talk depending on the audience. Maybe a little bit in terms of like style and pitch and tone and all of that, but the substance of it, it's the same, because the things I'm speaking to are universal. And again, I go back to, as Republicans, as conservatives, if what we're saying is the things we believe and the things we want to do and the things we prescribe are only appealing to the fringe on one side of the political spectrum, if that's true, then we're dead in the water. Like, there's no point in trying to win if that's true. I have a higher optimistic view of the future of conservatism and the Republican Party, not just in the state of Minnesota, but nationally. I believe that what we have on offer is life itself, right? Like, come with us if you want to live. That's our message. We're providing you with hope and pride and ambition and achievement and truth and virtue, glory and honor. That's what we have on tap, and it tastes pretty good. Come have a bit. That's our message. And if that don't appeal to the center, I don't know what will.
Well, I think part of the problem when we think about this is we expect politicians, people in politics, to be at the forefront of these battles, when in fact, those of us who are outside really have to, quit asking politicians to fall on their sword and carry the battle, because the battle, actually, politics is downstream of culture. And so when we ask politicians to lead the culture war, we're asking the wrong people to do it. One of the best things about my job at Hot Air is I can be full throated. I can't be canceled. I can't be tossed out on my ear from normal society, because I've got a group of people who, it's not the audience. The audience is great. But I also have employers who are going to back me up unless I do something, call for violence that is anti-civilization. And so we have to pave the way. And one of the most important things that has happened over the past decade has been the absolute collapse of respect in the news media, the in Hollywood, all the people who have been the shock troops for this movement. And I think a lot of that has been driven by people outside of politics. And it really goes back, I think, to Rush Limbaugh, who really helped pave the way. The big problem that we have is, and this is something I will lay at the feet of the Republicans, at least somewhat, is we conceded the education issue decades ago. And that is where we're going to have the hardest time rooting this out, is the purple-haired teachers with the BLM flags, with the transgender flags, who are, literally taking dolls and instructing kindergartners that this PP doesn't mean you're a boy. And that's going to be very hard to root out, although it's happening in red states. And it may very well happen in blue states, because one thing that activates parents, we saw this in Virginia, is when people mess with their kids. So, but I think the people who have to bear the biggest burden are really is not the politicians. Politicians are working with what they have. And, back when the mainstream media created the only reality that there was for most people, like Walter's in-laws, I watch the news. This is where I get my information. I mean, there are tens, maybe hundreds of millions of people in the United States who actually believe, because the Associated Press, ABC, CBS tell them that you cannot say gay in the public schools in Florida. I mean, that is calumny. It's not remotely true. Just like they're saying you cannot teach about Rosa Parks. I mean, Black history is required in Florida. No one is attacking Black history. What they're saying is, even, by the way, the advanced placement people admitted that their curricula was too ideologically charged. Yet, most people think that they're banning books on Black people, on gay people. No, what they're doing is they're banning books that instruct 12 and 14-year-olds how to get onto Grindr, to get dates with adult men. Those books are in the public schools, and they're telling the American people that we're trying to ban To Kill a Mockingbird. So it's on us to undermine the narrative that is out there in the mainstream media. And by extension, we undermine the Democrats because they just parrot it. I mean, you still see Democrats. I mean, Joe Biden the other day talked about how, MAGA types killed 5 people in the Capitol on January 6th. It's like, that's just a lie. And yet nobody calls them on it. So what we need to do is attack the narrative that is out there, and by extension, or you attack it by undermining the lies. And it can be done, but the period of time, Adam Smith once said something, there's a lot of ruin in a nation. He was responding to somebody who was saying that the American Revolution was going to destroy the British Empire. It was going to ruin the country. And his response was, well, there's actually a lot of ruin in a nation, which is another way of saying that things can go much longer than you think. Extreme things will happen that you can recover from when it looks like all hope is lost. I mean, the British Empire stuck around for another couple hundred years. Well, 120, 140. And eventually it couldn't go on forever. But it was World War One that killed it.
So David, for the election in 2024, I mean, Republicans, conservatives need to get out the message to counter their narrative. If there is a pivot that wins, I think it's that conservatives need to be able to sell freedom and sell limited government and sell what it means to strengthen families and parental rights. Like in Virginia, when they really made that narrative struck at home with education, to take back their state, to take back their schools, take back their education system. But I want to just in the last few minutes talk about gun control, because Minnesota is seeing gun control legislation come through. And just like after every horrific shooting, Democrats lockstep say, this is why we need gun control bills, even though when asked, can any of the bills that they're pushing, would that actually have prevented this shooting? And in this case, we look at someone who had a mental illness, who was under care, and perhaps should not have been able to get a gun. I don't know how this person acquired a gun or not, but how do we address?
It was legal.
Yeah. How do we tie mental health? I mean, I think Democrats and Republicans should agree we have a mental health crisis in this country, mental health problem, certainly. And how does that tie into gun control?
Well, it ties in very directly. So that's the other thing, is the fact that a shooting was involved, and that a shooting is now integral into this broader transgender conversation that we've been having this whole time. It's not arbitrary. It is connected, because the real cause, putting the pieces together, maybe there'll be some information that comes out that spins it off in some unanticipated direction. But based upon what we currently know, the real cause of this shooting was a cognitive dissonance within the mind of the perpetrator, that caused her to believe that she was affirming herself, or that she had gotten to a point of complete and total despair about the lack of integrity between her identity and reality, and decided to just go out with a blaze of glory. That's why this happened. Not because guns exist, not because of the gun on Eric Lucero's hip. The gun on Eric Lucero's hip is not the reason why there was a shooting in Nashville. The guns in the my neighbor's safe are not the reason why there was a shooting in Nashville. And this is the issue, is that I think there's a certain degree of, at this point, mockery that is appropriate of this tired and absurd and ridiculous script that the Democrats pull out of their desk drawer every time one of these incidents happens, that redounds to a caveman mantra of guns bad, guns bad, guns bad. It is so unsophisticated and unserious. It literally ignores the red flag bill that's now part of the public safety omnibus that we're going to be marking up tomorrow here at the legislature. That bill is predicated on the premise that there's a set of circumstances that justifies circumventing due process in order to go into somebody's home to take away their guns. And the circumstances are going to be so dire that they present an imminent threat to themselves or others, therefore requiring such an extreme response. And all we're going to do about it is take their guns. That's the level of sophistication that the Democrats have on offer. It's extraordinarily childish and ridiculous, and helps no one. It's like superstition. It's like witch doctor stuff. If we take the evil talisman away, if we apply leeches to the wound, that's going to make it better. It's not serious. If you want to have a serious, sophisticated, nuanced, impactful, real conversation about these incidents, you have to address the culture and the policies that are leading people to make these decisions and then enabling them to do it. And plus, there's this little existential issue of you're never going to get rid of the guns. It's just not going to happen. There's more guns than there are people. Okay. You're not going to get them all. And the more difficult you make it for people to, in law-abiding fashion, keep and bear arms, then all you're doing is putting a thumb on the scale in favor of those who don't care what the laws are.
Yeah, well, and in fact, they want more gun laws, but they want to pick and choose who they prosecute. Gun laws are rarely enforced, particularly against violent felons.
Right.
And in fact, prosecutors across the country have explicitly said, we are not going to prosecute these violations of gun laws because it disproportionately impacts protected classes of people.
There you go.
And so we want more gun laws, but we're only going to enforce them against law-abiding people, not people who have actually gone out and committed crimes with guns. I mean, every day you can read a story about a known wolf who commits a violent crime, sometimes multiple violent crimes, and winds up killing people at some point, and they will have had gun charges against them dropped. And so, there is, it's not just hypocrisy. They're actually picking certain people to arm and want to disarm other people. And so, Walter's right. There's nothing serious about this. Just as if someone is actually so mentally ill that they're a danger to themselves and others, then by definition, they should be committed. That it was the standard for committing people. We no longer do that. And the results are clear. They are literally in our streets. People are dying on our light rail trains. People are sleeping in the streets, almost all of whom are mentally ill. And it's out of compassion that we don't help them. We leave them to rot in the street, to die of drug overdoses, because we don't want to tell people you're mentally ill, you need help, and we are going to force it upon you. You are no longer behaving in a rational fashion. Instead, we're just going to pretend that someone is not rational, take away their guns, and say we did something.
You're absolutely right. We've turned everything upside down. The idea that it's somehow distasteful to commit somebody to help, to treatment, when they have a demonstrable inability to function in society and abide by that social contract we talked about earlier. If we're saying that that's too distasteful, how is it somehow tasteful to initiate force against them by taking their property, taking their guns, and then leaving them in what will be in your wake in aggravated crisis? It's such an absurd policy. And I made this point in committee when we heard the red flag bill originally. I just explicitly told Chair Becker-Finn that she's presenting people with the duty to die with one of her bills. That was having to do with the storage bill, where you're required to keep your gun locked away separate from your ammunition. So, you're under imminent threat and you got to call a timeout so you can get your crap together and then proceed with the confrontation.
Wait a moment.
Yeah, exactly. But then with the red flag thing, it's just so deeply unserious. And these are the same people who claim that we need to have all these wraparound services for criminals, right? We need to come around and find out how they became a victim of society and how we can make it better, how we can kiss the boo-boo. But somebody who's in genuine mental health crisis, we're just going to take their guns and call it a day? Yeah, it's stunning.
That's the argument we've been making against red flag laws for years. It's come to the legislature, is if it's that serious of an issue, if they are a threat to themselves or others, then we already have a law in the books to lock them up for 72 hours for a psychological hold, to evaluate them. Instead, as you said, Walter, they just come in and take their guns and leave them sitting in their house, upset at the world. So We'll see. We'll see if this recent shooting has any impact on the legislation coming through the legislature in Minnesota. But my guess is that it may have just allowed the last senator in the last Democrat senator who was our hope of not passing it. Maybe it gave them an excuse to vote for the bill. We'll find out. But I want to thank both of you guys for participating in a lengthy discussion about these transgender bills coming to that pass the Minnesota legislature and how it impacts things nationally. And I want to thank the listeners for tuning in to another episode of the Omnibus Podcast, where all subjects are germane. 1,000-page omnibus bills that nobody knows what's in it.